Good evening, everyone. My name's Aurelio Maraca. I'm the technology coordinator here at the Danbury Library. And once again, we welcome you to this part two of a climate story, the Industrial Revolution, with Professor Mitch Wagener of the biology department at Western Connecticut State University. And before I begin, I just want to say thank you for joining us this evening on behalf of the Friends of the Danbury Library who provide this funding and support for this program and other programs. We suggest that you check out our calendar of events that's coming up. And I think you'll enjoy it. So without further ado, Professor Mitch Wagener, you have the con, sir.
Hello, everyone. For the first time in a while, I'm not wearing my WestCon shirts. I'm wearing a T-shirt of my alma mater, where I went to grad school, University of Alaska Fairbanks. So if you see the little polar bear here, that's what that is. Just happen to be wearing it today. Well, this is part two of a story which we began last week, I guess it was. And it's a story I've been telling for quite some time because I've figured out that climate change, when I was designing my first course, which was some years ago, I realized that climate change was not just a bunch of science. It isn't just a bunch of atmospheric chemistry or anything like that. It's also human history and human culture and all sorts of other things. And there are events that were instrumental in getting us where we are today, both positive and negative. And one of them is the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to work our way toward it and talk about some other events which have cultural significance and so on. One of the big events in history, which was whenever I was in college, way back when, and it was not discussed or wasn't discussed in this way, is the Great Dying. The Great Dying is the result of Native Americans' first contact with North Americans. Be aware that whereas the Europeans and the Africans who forcibly came a little later, had a long history of domesticated animals. The Native Americans did not. There weren't any, with the exception of guinea pigs and turkeys, and they were not the kind of critters that possessed pathogens that would jump species. So many of the diseases that have been, terrible for humans, including smallpox and the Black Death and all that stuff, are zoonotic diseases. They are ones that jump from one species to the other. And here we go. When the Europeans first arrived in North America in the modern era, 1492. Of course, there were Europeans here when we talked about last time, and when Leif Erikson's colony, short-lived colony in Newfoundland, but that was a small thing. The big event started in 1492 and continues on. In 1492, conflicts and diseases reduced the indigenous population of the Americas by 90%. One of the things that the Pilgrims, the Puritans who settled in Massachusetts, noticed was that the native villages were empty. The next thing they noticed was that one of the natives they did meet spoke the Queen's English, which kind of freaked them out. It was Squanto, or I guess that was his name. I don't know what his real name was, who was kidnapped by fur traders and grew up in London and then worked his way back to the New World. So depopulation left large areas of agricultural land untended, and these old fields gradually reverted to forest. Regrowth removed around enough CO2 from the atmosphere to cool the atmosphere by an average of 0.15 degrees Celsius in the late 15 and early 1600s. Okay. the exposure of Native Americans without the resistant to European diseases such as smallpox was devastating, absolutely devastating. The same way it was for the Aztec when Cortez was making his march towards Tenochtitlan and Pizarro and in Peru and so on. And those germs were decisive. Our history would be very different without them. All right. There we go. So the Great Dying then was a large die-off of native peoples in the New World because of exposure to these diseases. And so that human-driven global impact on the Earth system was 2 centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution, but important anyway. The drop in temperature from CO2 being sucked out of the atmosphere by the regrowth of the trees from the agricultural lands the natives had tilled for a long time exacerbated cooling that were caused by other things and led us to a time we call the Little Ice Age. Remember last time we talked about the medieval warm period, and this is what followed the medieval warm period. And so European colonization of the Americas indirectly contributed to this colder period by causing the deaths, and not intentionally, but causing deaths of 56 million people by 1600. Smallpox and measles, and then warfare and societal collapse caused by the other things led to a much easier conquest by Europeans. 55 million hectares fell into disuse, about the size of France. Wildlife populations might have also grown as the population of human hunters decreased when the number of Native Americans who hunt buffalo decreased. The buffalo populations could grow because their main predator was gone. And so by the time the Europeans got to the Great Plains, there were vast herds of buffalo, which perhaps had not been so numerous just a few hundred years previous. Well, the Little Ice Age was something that we noticed in some parts of the world, but not in others, a period of cool and unsettled climate after the medieval warm period. And 16th through the 19th century was something that did affect New England, and historically it was noted down, and we'll talk about it. There were 3 particularly cold points in the 3 minima: 1650, 1770, and 1850. Generally speaking, their individual locations would have had their own minima. The one thing that was strengthening that cold time was the fact that the sun was particularly quiet for part of that time, and that's what's called the Maunder minimum, named after some bloke named Maunder who noticed it. And there was also increased volcanic activity. Volcanoes put dust in the air, which shades the sun and causes more of the solar radiation to radiate back into space, increases albedo of the atmosphere, as scientists would say. And it was just a whole bunch of things all happening at the same time. Okay, which happened. That's the way it is sometimes. So also the thermohaline circulation, which is the circulation of the ocean waters from bottom to top, from top to bottom, and around the world, is driven by differences in density of the water, which is a function of how salty that water is and how cold it is, cold water being denser than warm water. And because of the melting of Greenland in the medieval warm period, there was all this fresh water that was flowing into the North Atlantic, which is one of the areas where normally you get sinking. And so it tended not to sink. And so the whole conveyor belt of heat that is what we call the thermohaline circulation was slowed down. And there was reforestation in Europe. Remember, they had the Black Plague that had followed the Great Famine. And so they too, in Europe, had a decrease in the population, which meant that fewer people were farming, which meant more trees were growing back, and so on. And so it was all happening at the same time, and had a fairly significant effect. Now, it also had some effect culturally. The Netherlands is a small country where people love their ice skating, and yet in the present day, it's not really cold enough for there to be many frozen rivers and canals for them to ice skate on. So where is it that they picked up this ice skating? Well, Peter Bruegel the Elder, a painter in 1565, painted a bunch of Dutch people out playing around on the ice. Looks like they're playing hockey and skating around just for the heck of it. So it must have been colder back then. We can see at sometimes bits of history in the paintings that are depicting certain events that are happening in certain times. Okay. And so this is Netherlands as it was when it was cold during the Little Ice Age. The same time, the Thames in Britain would freeze, which it doesn't do now, and they used to have what they called ice fairs on the Thames, and the frozen ice, frozen river water would be cut up for blocks for used in refrigeration systems and so on. And here is, I don't know the artist, but it was from 1677, showing pretty thick ice, thick enough for people to walk around on it and cut big slabs of it and haul it away. And it was about this time when Europeans found that ice skating was fun. And it was first, I mean, it used to be transportation in Scandinavia and among the Lapps, the Sami and so on. But in the more southern parts of Europe, which previously hadn't been so cold to have a lot of ice, it became recreation ice skating in Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Netherlands in the 17th century and 16th century. And another painting from the Netherlands at that time, you can see more of what looks like hockey being played. Now, at the same time, in medieval Scotland, another sport was being developed, and that's curling. Curling is a lot like, it reminds me of shuffleboard on ice. Uh, I find I'm fascinated by it. Every 4 years, when the Winter Olympics shows curling matches. Well, it was invented in Scotland, and it's been um, become very popular in Canada as well. And there's a curling rink in Fairbanks, Alaska, where I used to live, although I never tried it and never had occasion to. But it began as an outdoor sport. And we have paintings of it as well. This is what modern curling looks like. You get these bullseye and ice, and you've got these guys with brooms and women with brooms, and they're rolling, or not rolling, they're pushing, sliding these granite boulders with handles on them. And the idea is to hit the bullseye and knock the other team out of the bullseye. Something that you would have to do in the wintertime. And there were, in fact, this is 1860, and Scotland depiction of curling. Now, a little bit more tenuous in the cultural events that were associated and might have been associated with the Little Ice Age is the formation of the Iroquois League. The Haudenosaunee, which was a group of 5, then 6 related tribes who at lived in upstate New York and adjacent areas of Canada and parts of Pennsylvania, including the Mohawk and so on, had a history of fighting among themselves as people do, and they were having troubles with crop failure because of, the fact that it had been so cold. And of course, when people are stressed by not having enough food, that also encourages warfare. And a individual who has come down in history as the Great Peacemaker. He had a name, Wida, and I have no idea whether how badly I'm mispronouncing his name. He basically walked around trying to convince the five tribes, and later on the Tuscarora joined them, into becoming forming a joint civilization where they had a constitution written in, that was memorized, that would govern their affairs and keep them from making bad decisions. And part of that was the seven generation principle, the notion that you make decisions based on what's best for seven generations to come, which I think very highly of that particular innovation. The Great Peacemaker had a spokesman named Hiawatha, not the Hiawatha you're thinking of in the poem. That was someone who was given the real Hiawatha's name. But anyway, and so the Great Peacemaker and Hiawatha talked the Haudenosaunee into the Great Law of Peace, perhaps as a response to starvation and crop failure. Certainly had influence by it, made everything more necessary. And these folks lived in upstate New York. The Finger Lakes are named after them. And later on, the Tuscarora came and joined to the west of the Seneca. In 1816, there was a particularly bad patch that basically was kind of the last hurrah, if you will, the last cold snap of the Little Ice Age. And this is what in New England was called 1800 and froze to death. It's called the year without summer. And this had all sorts of interesting ramifications, which we'll get to here. The historian John D. Post called it the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world. There was ice on the Susquehanna River in the middle of the summer, and there was crop failures left and right, and people really had a rough time at this time. And it was due to low and solar activity, overall the effects of the Little Ice Age, into the Little Ice Age, and a volcanic a volcanic winter, volcanoes erupting, which was, random things that happen. And it had the greatest effect on Northeast United States, Canadian Maritimes, Newfoundland, and Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe particularly. It was also known as the poverty year, and 1800 froze to death. Late frost in May killed off the crops in 1816 in New England. Two large snowstorms in June in New England. River ice as far south as Pennsylvania in July and August. 1812, La Soufriere erupted in St. Vincent in the Caribbean. Awu in Indonesia. 1813, Suwanosejima in Japan. And El Mayon, which I believe is in Mexico, in 1814. And so there was just pile up of dust in the air, which cool things off. And then Mount Tambora, a monster of a volcano, largest eruption in recorded history in 1815. It was heard 2,000 kilometers away and killed 71,000 people in what is now Indonesia. Prevailing winds blew the dust up away from the volcano past Bali and parts of Java and so on. And it had a cooling effect in 1816 in Western Europe, particularly southern the UK and in France. And on a rainy summer in 1816, a young, brilliant woman named Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, then age 18, although she had a child, and her future husband, the father of that child, Percy Shelley, visited Lord Byron, the British poet, who was married to Anne Millbank, who was a famous mathematician. This is relevant. Visited Lord Byron in a villa in Lake Geneva, by Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and they didn't have TV or internet or any of that kind of stuff. So they entertained each other by telling each other spooky stories. Mary Shelley, as she became known, her spooky story was Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, which is arguably one of the great works of English literature, but it was also arguably one of the first examples of science fiction. And it was a very important novel in discussing what it means to be human. That's an existential issue that the creature the man the creature that was reanimated tissue went through. It's very different than the movie. That in Mary Shelley's version, the creature himself was quite articulate and what didn't do the bellow, didn't do the thing. Um, and it's quite worth reading if you have not done so already. All right. Not too long out, and about that same time, there was something happening called the Industrial Revolution that happened first in the Midlands in the UK. Is definitely one of those, on the one hand, and on the other hand, good news, bad news sorts of things. It was certainly marketed as a great human achievement to figure out a way to use steam to run machines and to figure out that black rock that was dug out of holes in Wales burnt quite nicely, and you wouldn't have to chop down as many trees. And you could make all sorts of things, including trains and steamboats and all sorts of stuff with the work that was now done by boiling water and making steam. Previously, the energy that went into human civilization was human work, animal work, water wheels and things like that. It was small potatoes compared to what they were able to harness from steam engines. And so the steam engine was invented, and then coal was discovered as a good fuel, and that led to all sorts of stuff. So before the Industrial Revolution, the economy was based on manual labor and draft animals and water. Manufacturing by hand and simple machines, productivity of goods was low, but the quality was good. The quality was high for things such as cloth that was made by hand. It just took a lot of work to do. And energy sources for civilization were burning wood and biomass and peat and animal feces, cow chips, and harnessing river flow. It is what we would consider now carbon neutral, because there was not an introduction of carbon to any significant degree into the atmosphere that was not there in the carbon cycle previously. And it was during the Industrial Revolution that the demand for cotton really became a way that you could really get rich. Okay, cotton was grown in small amounts in certain areas like Egypt, and it was discovered that it grew really well in a certain area of the American South. And unfortunately, that was an area that was inhabited by Native Americans, which led Andy Jackson to push them all out and give them Oklahoma instead, only temporarily, of course. And the economic system was set up at that point to um, allow uh, wealthy white men to buy land. And at that time, slavery previously had been kind of decreasing. It had become less of an issue and it was considered to be dying. And then the introduction of cotton, because of the demand from steam engines in Europe, made slavery profitable again. And so humans were sold down the river. That's where that name came from, that phrase came from, and were sold from rice plantations and indigo plantations in the farther north into the deeper south, and cotton became a thing. Cotton became king. Fibers previous to, I mean, in the previous time when cotton could only be produced slowly, the fibers were separated from the seeds by hand carding before 1800. In fact, you can buy cards today. The tools, the wooden and metal tools that you can buy them. I got this picture from eBay of all places. And people, slaves, slave labor, the women would sit in this big pile of cotton and separate out the fiber using those paddles and a huge amount of effort. And the seeds themselves were useful, that you could squeeze cottonseed oil out of them, which can be used as a lubricant for machines and so on. And then this smart aleck guy named Eli Whitney, a northerner, invented a machine that made carding obsolete, the cotton gin. And this is, in fact, the facsimile of the illustration which he presented to get it what am I trying to say? To get his to get it so that he had the only get patented. There we go. Patented. And it was this hand crank gizmo. And here is a museum facsimile of it showing you how it all works. You put the cotton fiber in, you turn the crank, and it did the work of carding in a much more rapid way, which meant that you could produce an awful lot more cotton. And here was a illustration from a magazine showing the wooden version. One person was feeding in the cotton and another person was turning the crank and all that stuff. They're all made to look happy, but you can imagine. Whereas the white guys were there looking rich and smug. So cotton was king. Invention of the cotton gin increased the supplies of cotton from the South. Industrialization of weaving in Britain vastly increased the demand. Slaves from tobacco plantations in the Upper South were sold down the river, and slavery now became lucrative, which of course led eventually to the Civil War that we're familiar with. Now, in the latter part of the 18th century, cotton was production increased greatly as we got more machines to process it. Previously, cotton was spun, made into thread using wooden tools, wooden machines such as this, which were run by human legs, humans that were providing the energy for the machine doing its thing to make cotton thread. The first industrial revolution was in the early 19th century, mechanization of the British textile industry, engines powered by steam, boilers fired by wood and later coal, development of all metal machine tools, which centered in Britain, where they already had an industry of hand loomers. And the hand loomers were particularly the people who ran the wooden machines were not very keen on having their craft, as they saw it, yep, their livelihood taken away from them. And so they led a brief uprising against the big factories. They burnt a couple of them. And they had a fictional leader who was called King Lud. He was always portrayed in a gingham dress, and he was the person who was on the posters that was raising the rabble to get the weavers to go, attack the the factories because they were losing their livelihood. And so we have people who were not able to continue on with their comfortable way of doing things, becoming known as Luddites. And some of you may remember back in the 80s when computers were taking over for manual typewriters, there were a lot of people who were not very happy about that. And they didn't like the idea of using word processors, newfangled gizmos like that. And they were called Luddites. And that's where the term came from. Came from this fictional person, King Lud, portrayed here in his gingham dress, leading a rebellion briefly against the factories. The ability to burn coal and vastly increase the amount of iron forging that was possible, and that made for the production of metal tools, metal machines for for doing everything, including railroads and including making cloth and so on. And at the time, this was all seen, these smokestacks bellowing coal dust and coal smoke into the air was all seen as pastoral and very nice. Here we got a family over here looking off into the smoky future. And it did provide a lot of new things that were useful and allowed human civilization to progress, like railroads. Roads, I've never been on a stagecoach over a dirt road before, but I've heard it's not very comfortable. Railroads were much better and easier for people to move around. Another pastoral. Oh, another thing that the use of fossil fuels allowed was smelting large amounts of iron. And the Industrial Revolution was really an evolution, thousands of small innovations over several centuries. Industrialization would have happened anyway, um, some people think, but fossil fuels sped it up greatly. Concentrated energy, and we learned to take coal and pre-cook it to coke, which made the temperature of the burning coke now much more controllable and predictable. And there are benefits. I mean, more and cheaper goods. There are textiles and cotton. People like wearing cotton. I'm wearing a cotton shirt. We like wearing cotton because it's comfortable, even though we know that in the past it was made by quite a bit of human suffering. Steam power allowed us to do all sorts of stuff, iron smelting, refining of chemicals, and railroads. These were benefits in most ways, okay? But there were costs as well. Industrial cities, tenements, pollution, child labor. In order to run these weaving machines, you had to have small and nimble fingers there to keep them going, keep them working. And there were a number of children and young women who lost fingers and arms in those machines. And of course, if they're working at a young age, they're not going to school. And that was part of it too. And a cost that we're facing with now is the beginning of the transfer of carbon from underground into the atmosphere. That coal and the petroleum and the other things were the remains of previously living plants and phytoplankton, and they 300 million years previously were all underground where they could do no harm to us. But we dug them up and we found uses for them, which makes our lives more convenient, but it also is it warms the climate. Here are pictures of young children working in the mills, not wealthy children either. They're the poor folks, of course. Now, one of the curiosities that was made about the same time was the first computer. It was called the difference engine. It was invented by this inventor named Charles Babbage, and it was a steam-driven decimal, not binary, but decimal computer that it was only one example of it that was made, and it was made to make rapid mathematical calculations. The notion was that they'd be able to use it to aim their artillery better back during the wars of conquest of the British Empire. Being a computer, it also needed a programming language. And the person who wrote the programming language was a woman named Ada Lovelace. Her name after she got married was August Ada King, Countess of Lovelace. And she was, interestingly enough, the daughter of Lord Byron, the one who wrote poems, including Ozymandias, who some of you might have read. And Ada's mother was Anne Milbank, who was a famous mathematician at the time. Not too many women went into math or were allowed to. And Ada, her name was borrowed for a early computer programming language I remember in the 70s and 80s. Ada was one of many languages like Fortran and all that. So anyway, she was the first computer programmer on a steam-driven computer, and that was only built once. And I think replicas were built later on for museums, and I think that's what that is. The difference engine. Well, the introduction of fossil fuels provided economic growth to a huge amount of the world, including the United States and including Western Europe, including Japan, and so on. And the annual carbon emissions by region began as Western Europe being the leader, and it wasn't until after the Civil War that U.S. and Canada started catching up, and so on. And coal was in Britain up until the 50s. It was the primary way that homes were heated. You've all seen Mary Poppins and the chimney swifts and chimney and all that stuff. People up until 1950 would heat their homes in a fireplace using coal. And so those chimneys would get all gunked up and you'd have to hire someone to clean them out. Well, in 1955, I believe, there was a temperature inversion, a weather pattern that settled over the UK and it lasted for many days, and it kept the coal dust concentrated where the human population was, and a lot of people died. England, back in the Industrial Revolution and in the late 1800s, in the Sherlock Holmes days, was characterized by fog, London fogs. And it was the mood, the background mood for a lot of the literature at the time, including Sherlock Holmes. And it was because of the tendency to have temperature inversions that made the coal dust stay in one place until the inversion was knocked out. Well, this is a particularly bad one. And it was called the Great Smog. One might ask whether J.R.R. Tolkien named the dragon in The Hobbit the Great Smog from this. I don't know. It was December 5th through 8th, 1952. 4,000 people died and 100,000 were made sick. And Winston Churchill was prime minister again, and he resisted the idea of moving the coal out of London and the coal power plants and stuff like that. And apparently, a young Queen Elizabeth finally convinced him to change. And so our foggy, atmospheric London changed. And that is all I have to say on this, although I would be delighted to answer questions if you have any.
Yes, if you have any questions, please type it in the chat. We do have one already. Do we know how many people in total were living here in North America, South America, 1492? And is there any explanation to why Native Americans never domesticated animals?
Well, I don't know. I'm sure there are people, demographers and whatnot, who have estimated the number of population. The reason why they didn't domesticate animals probably was because there weren't any suitable animals that were willing to be domesticated. For an animal to be domesticated, it has to be willing to let humans make their decisions for them and decide who's going to mate with whom. Not all animals are suitable for that. Whereas horses and donkeys were domesticated early in the fertile, in the Middle East. Zebras were never, and their close relatives were never domesticated. They were tamed to some degree, but they tended to bite and not let go, and so zebras were never domesticated. The other thing is that the Native Americans apparently didn't see the need for draft animals, even if they had them, because they didn't use the wheel. The wheel was made into toys by the Aztec, but not because, and probably because, if for those civilizations like the Incas and the Aztecs that lived in the mountains, it wasn't very practical to have wheel carts and things like that. And so humans would carry the burdens around on their backs. It was a matter of not having the right animals and not having the right motivation. Native Americans domesticated plants, corn, maize, peppers, potatoes are all products of Native American civilization. But the only two animals I'm aware of that were domesticated, it was a guinea pig and a turkey, and actually not just two, but also llamas and alpacas, which are the Native American, or the camels that stayed here when the sea level rose at the end of the last ice age. That's a story that one could tell, and I'd be glad to turn that one in. I have that's a part of the lectures I give in my climate change course, and I'm happy to provide that for you guys if you're interested in. the whole idea of animal domestication.
Oh, wow, that'll be great.
I think it's a cool story, and it goes along with all this stuff. But in the new world, in the old world, they had cows that got domesticated twice, you know, and sheep and goats and chickens and turkey. Well, turkey's a new world, and one hump and two hump camels, all those animals. It just changed the way the lives that they could live, having access to them.
Huh. We have another question. Let's see. When the Industrial Revolution started, were there any people who warned about the effects of carbon in the future?
I cannot say categorically there weren't. They did not have the technology to study carbon dioxide and its heating effect at that point. In fact, the first scientific paper written that showed that carbon dioxide would absorb heat was in 1857 and written by a Eunice Foote, an American woman. And so 1857, and that was just the very start of it, and then there was a string of papers that scientists, seeing what other people have done, they took the experiment farther and learned more about it. Svante Arrhenius wrote a very important one around 1890 something or other. He's a Swedish scientist.
We have
And so,
another question.
yeah, it takes a while for that stuff to develop.
We have a question from James. Will changing to more electricity, i.e. electric vehicles, etc., appreciably reduce the carbon in the atmosphere and that much of electricity comes from uh, burning fossil fuels?
Well, we're going to have to change a lot of things. If the how green a plug-in hybrid car is, or how green the electric car is, depends on where the electricity is coming from. And if you're getting your electricity from a coal plant, that kind of, you may have some of the other benefits of an electric car, sporty and all that stuff and quiet, but it's certainly not going to be very green. But if your electricity is coming from a green source, wind and solar, for instance, then you are having a much more beneficial effect. There is no perfect energy source. Okay, there's always some little things that need to be done to it to make it less disruptive. But there's certainly some that are a whole lot better than others. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions for Professor Wagner? If not, we will call it an evening. And I guess that will be it for the evening. Uh, Once again, Professor Mitch Wagner, thank you so much for this two-part climate story series. I just want to let everyone know we are talking about doing another series of Earth in Crisis that is going to be set to start in January. So be sure to look out for that. And for all of those of you who want to share this talk with friends and family, I will be sending a link in the next couple of days once it's been uploaded to YouTube. Yeah, thanks again, everyone.
I
And
hope I hope you found it as interesting as I did. This is a fascinating topic to me, so that's why I like telling.
no, we did. If you look through the comments, people were very, very appreciative of your time and your expertise.
Great.
So thanks
Send your kids to WestCon. They're great.
thanks so much, Dr. Wagner, and thank you for thanks to all of you who participated in this talk this evening. Until next time, take it easy. Be well.